Well, good evening and congratulations. You're all virus warriors, as we are. It's wonderful to see a full house. We were a little worried it would be thin, but not at all. I'm very pleased to be here with such an illustrious panel. On my immediate left is Sam Dagher. He's written a wonderful book on Syria called Assad or We Burn the Country, which was the slogan that the regime advocates began to paint on walls and chant as they pushed back against the initial rise of anti-regime forces at the beginning of the war. Sam worked for the Wall Street Journal when I knew him in Syria. He's written for many important American publications, and he was one of the journalists who really brought home the horror of the Syrian war to American audiences. Next, Zaina Erhaim, who is at the moment well, she is by profession a journalist, as I am, and she works for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. She's a specialist in Iraq and Syria. She came here to London from Idlib back in 2010, was it, before the revolution started, to do her master's. Did it here and then watched as this revolution took off and couldn't bear not to be a part of it. So she went back and she became an activist and an organizer and a journalist, and she was instrumental in training many of the citizen journalists who were so important in getting the video of the atrocities of that war out to the West. And she's very proud to say that she was a real advocate for training women citizen journalists who became part of the forces of resistance. And finally, on my far left, Abdulrahman Almawwas. He too had a completely different life before the Syrian civil war. He was he had trained as an engineer, and he was just starting his master's degree in Aleppo when the revolution began. He too joined up and wore many hats and ended up, he is, I should have said right at the beginning, one of the co-founders of the White Helmets, and is now the spokesman for the White Helmets, which is continuing to do excellent work in Idlib, which is currently under bombardment, as I'm sure you know. And he spends his time between Syria and Istanbul doing that very important job. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. I'm going to start by asking our panel to bring us up to date. Where are we now? This civil war kicked off back in 2011. Pretty soon it'll be a decades-old conflict, and the fighting hasn't stopped. And the very unstable political next chapter is also unfolding, and it has all kinds of complexities, of course, and potential for real destabilization in the region. So we'd like to address that a little bit as well. I'm going to begin with Abdulrahman and ask you if you would give us in a nutshell, in a couple of minutes, a description of where we are now, where the battle stands, and what's happening particularly in Idlib.
First of all, I want to thank you very much about attending and listening to us. We are trying to move the photo on the ground around the world. What's happening today in Idlib, or the north of Syria, it's beginning from the last bombardment or the last attack that started on 1 December 2019 till the end of February. We have light a quiet days, last 3 or 5 days. But during this time, from 1st of December till the end of February, we faced to about more than 800 bombardment. It's different between shelling literally or between aircrafts from the sky. In this attack, we lost more than 600 civilians and injured more than 1,200. And you can imagine in this area, just near the border, we evacuated more than 1 million of civilians. And those 1 million, simply they choose to going to near borders, to the north of Syria, not to south of Syria. Just we ask ourselves, the regime and its allies advance on these areas, and they say they open humanitarian corridors. But all civilians prefer to going to another area. That's May it will attacking again and bombardment again. And also there is nowhere, just campaigns and some of helping of organization. But also in this time, we have to mention there were bombardment for 25 of schools. Just in 25th of February, the regime and its allies targeted 8 schools in Idlib, and that's caused to killed 21 between teachers and students. And also they destroyed completely 15 of hospitals. And we are not talking here about normal hospitals. It's just about like field hospitals or some basic hospitals. So there is targeting against infrastructures to make the people to leave their homes. And that's what the people do, and going to the north of border. And then after that, I think you heard about some demonstration called from Idlib to Berlin, and then they push of the borders to open the borders between Syria and Turkey, and then from Turkey to the Greece, and nothing of that's happened. That's the situation today.
If I may just comment on the Idlib part.
Please do, and maybe take up the narrative there and...
Yeah, well, I'm originally from Idlib, as Elizabeth has mentioned. And for me, what is fascinating when the 32 soldiers of Turkey were killed there, and I saw like my hometown trending on Twitter 10 years ago, before I came to London, and I was studying journalism in Damascus, when everyone like asked me where I'm from, and I would say Idlib, they would like, what? And we studied that at geography in the 9th grade. But many Syrians themselves didn't know what Idlib is. And for me, when seeing Idlib trending, and then even Trump himself was able to spell my hometown correctly, that for me was like, I wouldn't know how to describe it well. It was fascinating, but pretty sad, because
that's when you knew things were really bad.
Yes, yeah. I think. So from being completely neglected and out of the scene into being like an international field of battles. Like even foreigners, I remember the first foreigner I've ever seen, I think that was 2006 or something, because we don't have tourists who would come to our area. And I took a picture with them. There was a group of French, and I was wondering where they are now. And imagine now, even like, not to mention all the jihadis, Kazakhstans, and those people who I don't know where their countries are, who are inside Syria, and then the Iranian militias and the Hazards and the other ones who are fighting on the other side, and then this guy, which is has become a battlefield. So I think the most important thing for me, like Abdulrahman was highlighting the international scene, the general scene, but for me, the actual scene is how chaotic and how confiscated the situation is. So we can't even simplify it. At some point, me, like a human right, I would call myself a human rights defender. I was happy that the Turkish army was hitting Syrian fighter jets. And I'm completely against all armies. But eventually, like a war killing machine is being neutralized. So I can't but be happy. So taking positions with what is happening, or like really taking a harsh position with that or that, this is pretty difficult, not just for Syrians, I think for all like those who are on the human rights side of the story.
Can I just ask you, are the air raids daily?
Yes,
are there bombings
it's
daily?
Daily, and depends on the area. To be more clearly, it depends on the areas. That's maybe sometimes it's near front lines, so it's targeted by aircraft. Sometimes it's by artillery. It's more far of the front lines, and if they just want to evacuate this area or to make it empty.
So bombing is taking place to take out things like field hospitals, we know.
Infrastructures.
Also to frighten people to leave. And is some of it infrastructure, roads, bridges,
main roads,
this kind of stuff?
Schools, bakeries, and everything's there is no electricity. There is some generators, and also it's targeted sometimes by aircrafts. And also, this is the big problem, the civil defense centers also. In 3 months, they targeted more than 10 civil defense centers. Last time we just haven't able to move our ambulances with the alarming, because it will target it directly, because there is many طائرات استطلاع
drones.
drones, and it's just
for surveillance.
Exactly.
So if you move your ambulances, they're going to know you're there. And is it Russian and Syrian Air Force, both? What's the bombing?
It's difficult to identify if it's Russian or regime or the Syrian regime army, but it depends on the the size of
the
destroy.
destruction.
And also we make a system that's to alarm people. And this system, it depends on the communication between the base and between the aircrafts. And we use this system just to alarm the people. This airplane now, it's for Idlib city. And after 3 minutes, it will be above Al-Atarab city. So sometimes we will be able to identify the aircraft if it's Russian or regime, but there are both.
They're both bombing. And are any of the schools working?
Also, it depends on the area. If we speaking about near borders, about 10 to 15 kilometers, there is some schools. In Idlib city now, there are many schools, but it's undergrounds. They are working these schools, but undergrounds. So it depends on the area. But in general, we can say there is just between 20 to 30 of students, they have a chance to take their.
And
20 to 30%. Yeah.
But even if their schools are active, like after the latest campaign of attacks on Idlib, like after 8 schools were hit on the same day, you feel like this is systematic.
Sure.
8 schools, so would give an indication to all the parents, drop the schools, hitting hospitals, leave the nurses out, give the doctors away. So even if the schools are up and operated, many families wouldn't send their kids to it because of the current situation. Well, now after the Turkish latest deal with Russia, people would send them back, but then the first barrel bomb, the first hit, it will stop
I was going to say, is it barrel bombs and precision munitions, both?
Yes, both, and also there is cluster bombs. There is many kinds of bombardments of let's say rockets, but there are still barrel bombs.
Like official military ones, and then these homemade gas canister ones. And one final question to you, Zainab: what is the relationship between the civilians and the various rebel groups, or rebel fighter groups?
Well, it's not easy to say, but in general, for the civilians, they're literally living day by day, trying to survive. The worst relationship is with Tahrir al-Sham, HTC, which used to be an Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, because they formed this salvation government, and it was mainly taking a hell of a lot of taxes from the people when their funding started to decrease, and they were suppressing them in all ways, not just their personal freedoms. However, I would say the civilians really, even if they're like being treated unwell, suppressed or whatever, they're just trying to survive, and they're being pressured from so many targets. That they're targets for the indiscriminate bombing. They're targets for an angry jihadi who think he will go to heaven if he harassed the woman for not wearing the right dress code. So for them, they are turned into pretty passive because this is the only way to survive.
Sure.
So for me, to see the people of Amarat and Naman and Sarai, for example, those two, which has been always the hub for civil society organizations, and we all worked in those areas because of this, to see them after all that protesting against Al-Qaeda and against the Russian, and this is, for me, it's like unbelievable. Because even when I was living there, I was counting 10 times before posting anything anti-rebels on my social media. Okay, I can write against the regime, but I want to survive here, so I shouldn't be doing that. So for a civilian who doesn't even have the support of an international organization, who's not even has a visa or a passport to travel, to be able to take that step, it gives you like an impression about how angry and frustrated they are and how helpless. And especially because they do know by now that they're not supported by anyone and they're going to be left alone, whatever happens. They don't trust anyone. I think before, when Turkey started the latest military operation, some of them had hopes that Turkey will take over, and even that for them, they were that desperate to agree that Turkey is taking over on the price of just stopping the bombardments. And then when they discovered that the no-fly zone that we've been speaking about for 9 years was as easy as this, and everyone was saying no military operation can happen in Syria, and then within 1 day, Turkey was able to impose that. I think that was the peak time where they're like, the whole world is do it, and we won't really count on anyone. And then they're being used by Turkey as a pressure on Europe, this is the maximum humiliation
Yeah.
that anyone can feel. And for me, we are really everyone. We are turning those people into suicidals because what they're living is hell. There is no other hell that they can go to.
One final question before we go to Sam, a simple one. Is there enough food?
Yes, there is a food, and here also the problem. The world now see the problem in Syria. It's just on the humanitarian level. There is a food, there is a campaigns, there is a place for people to sleep or to live. Yes, there is some places, and there is a food. There is base medicine or medical life. Let's see. But this is not the problem. This is not the main problem because this million people they choose to going to these areas, not going to the regime or government controlled area. And here, what the international community or what's the world did for those, just sending humanitarian convoys, and that's what in last 10 days we have trips around the capitals in Europe, and from all of them or most of them. And all of them, the biggest European Union members, they said we cannot do anything against a humanitarian convoy. And you told them you cannot, sorry for this example, but you cannot help the cancer with a Panadol. And that's what happened with Syria. Just give them a Panadol and humanitarian and just give them money, just support some
Oh,
organization.
they're giving us Corona, Habibi. No worries.
Yes. So this is not the solution.
Right. The complexities of the situation are mind-boggling, as you alluded to, and I think, Sam, you're the right person to wade into the politics of this and a little bit of the history from the regime side. What's going on? What is Bashar al-Assad thinking? What's the game plan? What's the future? Where are we?
Thank you. Thank you, Liz, for your wonderful introduction, and thank you, everyone, for braving the current situation and coming tonight, and also to the Frontline Club for hosting us, and wonderful to be on stage with talented Syrians and veteran reporter. Yes, so I'm supposed to go into his head now. Okay.
Good luck.
As I've been trying for the past decade. So I think it's still the same thing. I mean, he's motivated by the same thing that motivated him. The first moment the Arab Spring started, and the first moment you had the protests in Syria, it is to punish Syrians for daring to speak out. It is to punish Syrians for daring to challenge him and challenge this regime. It started out in Daraa on March 18th, 2011, when the first two protesters were shot, killed. The idea back then was we needed, when I say we, him, his brother, his cousin, the heads of the intelligence services. They are the backbone of the police state, and their idea was we needed to scare people off the streets. So by shooting a couple of people, everybody will go back home. But unfortunately, it only widened, the circle of bloodshed. And Syrians continued to protest, for the most part peacefully, up until the fall of 2011, before they even took up arms. And by then, the death toll was over 3,000. They've tried to occupy squares in major cities as early as April, if you remember, in Damascus. You might have been following the situation back then. Activists both in the city, in the capital, and in the suburbs tried to occupy one of the major squares in Damascus, Abbasine Square. They hadn't even made it, to the proper sort of administrative borders of Damascus when machine guns were unleashed on them and people were massacred on the streets. And the same happened in Homs after they had briefly occupied the main square there for less than a day. Then they finally managed to occupy a major square in Hama, which is one of the major cities. And they were there for a couple of months. I think it was end of June, right? July. They were there until August, and then President Obama came out and said to them, "We will not allow Bashar al-Assad to do what his father did 30 years before in Hama, which is a city that was massacred by his father." But
His days are counted.
his days are counted, but nothing was done. I mean, in fact, the U.S. and the French ambassadors visited the protesters in Hama, and they were greeted with flowers, and protesters thought that this would give them a measure of protection, but at the end, Bashar assaulted the city, killed a few hundred people, and the U.S. and its allies did nothing. And I think at that moment, Bashar knew that he had a green light to do whatever he needed to do to reassert himself, and that the West would do nothing. And I think that has kept him going since then, that no matter what he does, there are no consequences because nobody cares about Syrians. And at that moment, obviously, as the circle of bloodshed widened, people were militarized. Some citizens took up arms to protect, initially to protect their own communities from being assaulted by the regime. And then some of the defectors also organized themselves into, there were ragtag rebel groups at the time, just a couple of, defected officers with AK-47s and just protecting the protesters. At that moment, obviously with the U.S. and its allies wanting to take a bit of a backseat in that conflict, you had the regional powers step in to assert themselves and pursue their agendas. On the opposition side, immediately you had Turkey and Qatar, who had their own agenda as part of this push. You could say they were riding the wave of the Arab Spring. They wanted to not confront the Arab Spring, the protests that were taking place in all these countries, but in fact to manipulate them, to use them to bring their Islamist allies to power, the Muslim Brotherhood. And they succeeded in doing that in Egypt, and then they were going to do it in Libya, and they felt Syria was no exception. So they started funding and arming rebel groups, but obviously these groups had to abide by whatever the Qataris and the Turks wanted. The Saudis, who had a different agenda because they were scared of the Arab Spring. What if the Arab Spring succeeded in places like Egypt and Syria? It would be only a matter of time before Saudi citizens would want the same thing. So they did everything in their power to destroy the Arab Spring, but they also went in Syria under the guise of supporting the opposition, supporting the rebels, but with their own agenda. So you had, at the end, these three powers competing for the allegiance of all these different rebel groups. They were supposed to be on the same agenda, which is to bring down the regime, right? But at the end, they were competing against each other. On the regime side, Iran came in. Iran was there from the very beginning. You have to remember, Iran has an alliance with the Assad regime since the inception of the Islamic Republic, 1979. Then they had been in the country in a very significant way, starting from 2005, when Bashar was vulnerable and he was sanctioned for what he did in Lebanon. He was accused of murdering the former prime minister there. So the Iranians and Hezbollah were already in Syria, so they stepped in from the first moment to support him with fighters, with money. So they were very crucial. This was way before the Russians got involved. And because the Syrian army unraveled at the beginning of the uprising, a lot of soldiers just deserted or defected. So he needed manpower. So they stepped in to fill that vacuum. And of course, at the same time, you had the Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Iraq and Syria rise up. And from the very beginning, Bashar chose to go after the other opposition, not ISIS, not Nusra. He cared more about the Syrians who, again, we have to be careful. I know this word maybe rubs people the wrong way, the moderate rebels, but guess what? Yes, these people were moderate, and these are the people that scared the regime more than any other group, and he went after them the hardest, exactly as his father did in the mid-70s when he faced a similar challenge. He went after the peaceful protesters and the moderates first, and then he confronted the Islamists and said, "I'm fighting terrorism," to basically punish everyone, punish all Syrians. And the son was doing the same thing. And the mindset, I mean, the title of the book, which is their own slogan, and really kind of distills the mindset of this regime, of both father and son. Either they stay in power, or Syrians must suffer, must die, must lose everything. And it's really, I think, this slogan is what's motivated them from the very beginning. So we saw it in one city after another. All of you remember Homs, which suffered a 2-year siege. People were starving to death in Homs for 2 years before the city surrendered. You remember suburban Damascus, Douma, hit with chemical weapons in 2013, also besieged and starved into submission. All of you remember Aleppo in 2016, same scenario, and now Idlib. And the thing about Idlib, finally, Elizabeth, is many of the people who refused to submit to the regime, because it wasn't only the fighters that were taken out of these areas, Homs, Aleppo, suburban Damascus, but also civilians who didn't want to live under regime control again, were bussed, and remember those green buses, that the regime chartered, I mean, if I can use that word, to take people to Idlib, to dump them in Idlib. I mean, this is the word he used. And now he's basically finishing them off. So he's taken back parts of Idlib, and you have now 4 million people squeezed in a corner of northwest Syria that normally is home to about a couple of 100,000 people.
I think anybody who's been in a demonstration here in London and who's been kettled by the police, has it happened to you? That's what's happened, but on a national scale, with these people just forced into the upper left-hand corner of their country, and the man who's behind it all, whose determination to stay in power and keep his mafia clan in power, is still standing, incredibly, after all these other countries and interests dove in for their own purposes. I guess the big question maybe we could try and answer tonight is, so what can we possibly do now? And maybe you, Sam, could address what problems Bashar is facing, because he may be standing, but
Right.
he's been
Right.
rocked a little bit. Max, are you here? How much time do we have? To 8:30? Okay, great. So let me, if I may, if you think this is a good idea, let me ask each of you to, in a nutshell, explain what you think how the best possible way forward. What should the world be doing and what Syrians should be doing? And then after that, we'll open up to the floor and you can ask questions and we can see where you'd like to take the discussion. So why don't you begin? What should we be doing and what should Syrians be doing now?
I think Syrian people do their best. That's what I think. In 2011 and 2012, they're going to the street and they ask for a freedom and democracy country. And then thousands of them arrested, thousands of them with no idea about what's happened with them now. Their families don't know anything about them. And hundreds of thousands killed of these people, civilians. And now, what's the international community do? If we will ask ourselves what we are hoping from, or what we are hope from the world, we have to recognize or divide between two, the governments and the people. If we will go to ask the governments and that what we did during the 9 years, we have nothing. Because last times, and now what the regime and Russian request in the international community and the Security Council to stop all humanitarian aid from Turkey or from Jordan and just going through Damascus. And if we just come back about 10 days behind, during the clash between Turkey and the regime, there were some armed or military persons, military soldiers with the regime. They have their UN backpack in their backs. So you can imagine UN humanitarian aid going to the army, the soldiers, and that's what Russia will vote for it. We more than disappointed from the international community because the Russian used 12 veto against the Syrian, and all of them it was against humanitarian aid. So maybe it's a big lie if we will spare the humanitarian and political issues, because it's related, and all politicals using this humanitarian paper to play about their benefits. Now, if we will ask what, as a Syrian people, what are waiting or what we think from the people around the world, I think this is very important example. In this hall, there is many of yours and listening from us, and that's what, for me, it's very good and it's very hope. The people heard about our stories and they know what's happened in this area of the world, and they will tell their families, their children, what's happened in Syria, and they will stand with us. And I'm sure maybe one of you, he will have the power in 1 day to change some of these events, even if Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in any area around the world. I think we can do something. Maybe we have to thinking about to change our tools, but if we have the wall, we can do something for those people.
So, like,
Yeah, Zain.
like Abdulrahman, I think, like all Syrians, I don't believe in international organizations. I certainly don't believe in UN or the systems that were imposed by them. If I can recommend offline, I would say abolish UN, but being respectful here. So what I believe in is really the people. Someone like you who would come to this small, crowded, despite all the craziness that is happening around London. I think one of the main things that we can campaign for, something that he mentioned, keeping the Syrians in the scene, keeping the stories alive, listening to Syrians instead of international white people speaking about the Syrians, which is still happening, and you still read a lot of panels and a lot of experts speaking about us without us. We still need to say that after 9 years. One of the main things that I would love to see more is actual fight against impunity, whether it's on the individual's level, whether it's on the military level. Germany is doing great work because there were Syrian organizations, civil society organizations that are dedicated and they are well funded to be able to do that. So we're hearing plenty of cases. Recently, we've heard a couple of cases in France. Certainly, until now, nothing is happening in the UK on that phase, although there are pretty much lots of criminals, Syrian criminals, who are living around us. One of them is still British, and she is still living in Damascus. One of the things that I would also advocate for, and Syrian civil society has been doing an amazing work, such organizations that Abdulrahman does, and all the others were working with women, marginalized groups, and are trying to really work on coexistence and peace in these dire situations. So keeping those alive, giving them the push to stay, especially those who are based in the region, in Turkey and Lebanon, and they're facing a huge amount of restrictions on all levels, to give them the support and keep advocating for them. And I would shout for the women journalists who are working in Idlib now, because those are the ones who are on the hierarchy level. Those are the ones who are on the floor. They are being pushed by the patriarchal conservative societies that they belong to. They are neglected, certainly, by many of the international organizations because they don't speak the language. They're not being hired because they live in a very difficult situation. And above all that, they're women and they're trying to be journalists. So trying to repost, translate, and advocate for those women who are still there and they're still the voices of what is happening is also very essential. Just keep an eye and ear. I think that would be perfect for now.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything. I was just, well said, both of you. I would just add that, we have to, we see in the news that Assad has won, and there's nothing we can do, and we should at some point maybe reestablish diplomatic ties with him, and I think that would be a disaster. I'll tell you why. On the face of it, it looks like he's won, but the moment the Russians leave, the moment the Iranians withdraw their support, he'll fall down, because he's only there because of their support, because of their military support, because of their financial support, because of their political support. In fact, he plays them off against each other. Whenever the Russians try to get him to make push him or try to advise him to make some concessions or political concessions, he leans on the Iranians to begin assaults like the one we saw in Idlib. So the economy is in horrible condition at the moment. The lira has the Syrian lira, the pound has devalued by more than 50% in the past couple of months because of what's going on in Lebanon. Lebanon was sort of a lifeline for many of the Syrians living under regime control. The situation is horrendous. I mean, the military map tells us he's in control of most of Syria. But if we were to have a map of allegiance, he would be a loser, because most of the people living still under regime control are in their heart of hearts against the regime, but they don't dare speak out because he reasserted himself. The intelligence services, the mukhabarat, as the Syrians call them, are watching everyone. People don't even want to be seen speaking to each other on the street because this may expose them to questioning by the mukhabarat. So you can imagine the climate of fear and repression. But the moment they have the choice to speak out, many of them are still against him. And in fact, with the protests that happened in Lebanon in mid-October, Syrians were inspired, even the ones living under regime control. We saw some protests in the southern province of Suwaida under regime control. They came out for about a week, and they tried in other parts of Syria, in Salami, outside of Hama, but again, the level of repression and fear was just incredible. And they tried in Dara, and there were even attempts in the coast, which is the stronghold in Tartus, in the city of Tartus, which is considered the stronghold of the regime, and that's the Russian bases up the coast. So, I mean, that's the environment inside Syria. And why should we care? I think we should care, if only for selfish reasons. I'll tell you why. First of all, if we want the refugee crisis to be resolved, if we want people to go back home at some point, if we want people not to stop coming, if we want Turkey, if we want this situation where Turkey is using refugees as pawns to stop, then we have to go to the heart of the problem, and the heart of the problem lies in Damascus with that regime. There has to be a solution. There has to be a transition. There has to be a way to heal the wounds, to have a real reconciliation, to have a real political transition, to have some path for Syrians to be able to go back. There needs to be justice and accountability. I mean, Assad committed the most war crimes, but others also committed war crimes, and everyone has to be held accountable. And I think Western countries, the UK, the US, Europe, could help tremendously in the justice and accountability file. And as Zaina was saying, I mean, there are attempts to go after figures in the regime in Germany and France and elsewhere. And I think that has to continue, that has to intensify in tandem with finding a political solution that perhaps could ease this regime out, hold this regime accountable. I think that's the only way you could see Syrians begin to go back. And I think that's important for the security and welfare of people here in the UK.
So does President Putin have to be a part of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, I mean, finally, I would just conclude why it matters to people here, to us, to the West, to Europe. I mean, think of the message that's being sent to strong men everywhere. It's okay to do what Assad and Putin and Erdogan and others are doing in Syria to pursue their own agendas. No one's going to go after them. No one cares. And Assad and Putin have been doing what they've been doing for 9 years now. And we're saying, well, it's in Syria. It's far away. It doesn't concern us. But just think about the message that that's being telegraphed to every strong man who is determined to stay in power at any cost. And I think that should really concern us and scare us. I mean, our future, the future of our children, the future of the values that we still believe in. And I think not enough is being said about that. And I think that's really hugely important to really remind everyone that really it concerns us. In fact, it is in our self-interest if the situation changes.
I
might
completely
just
agree, and yet
add pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And the message is not just for the powerful men. I think the message is for all of those who are trying to stand on the other side, who are trying to still defend the freedom of expression, or still trying to fight for a better future. They are completely feeling left alone on their own. This is a message for the rest. But very quickly, 3 years ago, the Home Office confiscated my passport because the regime reported it stolen. It was a pretty straightforward case, a regime against a journalist. However, my passport was gone. I ended up being a refugee in the UK. That example was used again by the Azerbaijani government. Oh, it's pretty easy to report a passport for a journalist to the Interpol system. I'm going to be doing that. And then many journalists and human rights defenders were thinking twice about traveling to countries that are sticking to the systems and cannot get them out. If I was caught in Emirates or in Turkey, I would have been deported back to Damascus, and that would mean me being killed, certainly. So it's not just giving a message to the powerful men, it's giving the message of those who are trying to stand on the right side of the story, and it is telling them, you're on your own. You're either crazy enough to go on your own, or just quit.
So let's talk a little more about the mechanism for holding some of the war criminals to account. How does that work? In national courts abroad? At the ICC? What's the best way to approach this? And or are we at the stage where we should really just be gathering documentation for a day when there is a forum and a court and they can be brought to justice?
We are working about documentation of the war crimes, but we faced like a complex process about the documentation. If, like an example, there is a bombardment for an hospital, or using chemical, let's say, chemical weapons, and that's happened. And we bring the evidence of using the chemical weapons against the civilians, not in the front line or military, just against hospital and civilian areas. And we take this evidence and send it to OPCW, let's say, or the organization that's care about these crimes. After that, they want to know who dropped this from the sky. There is an helicopter, and this helicopter, it's belong to the regime, because there is no helicopter in the sky of Syria except of the regime helicopters. Okay, who was the responsible of these helicopters? Then, who ordered this man or this soldier to drop this chemical weapons? Then, who ordered this, the captain or the leaders? Like this, just to reach if they're let's say Bashar al-Assad, no or not. If he knows about this, he will be like a criminal. If he doesn't, he will be nothing for him. Mm-hmm. And you can say about the chain of custody for these evidences.
Sure.
And you can imagine it will not happen if a country like Russia, it's in Syria, and it's with Syria. So we cannot say all of this, it will just like nothing, or it's not deserved. We are working to document all these things, and we have a faith. So one day it will come, and we will this documented. It will be do something, and we make like a logo. If it will not be for the accountability, it will be for history, and that's what we're working on.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Because we're working now with a local organization that are working in transitional justice. As Abdulrahman mentioned, to document especially the shelling and the bombing, it's almost mission impossible. But what they're focusing on all of the cases that we've heard in the European courts were mainly those people who are responsible for torture. So there is a person who is testifying, and they're looking for an entity that has a connection with Europe, like a French resident or citizen who was tortured in Assad prison, or his family member. And this is very few people. So imagine how many Europeans were tortured in Assad prisons. And despite that, we're hearing about 5 or 6 trials. Imagine if this is going on this serious scale. So that's why it's pretty specific. But it is happening, and it needs lots of sources, lots of support to track down those people and encourage them. to believe in accountability and to believe in justice after all what they've been through, and then to testify. A friend of mine, he is a journalist as well, he actually testified against the person who tortured him last week, and he was calling me on his way to that. He was in the state security forces, and he was terrified. He's a very well empowered journalist, but for him to see that person after 6 years who tortured him in 2011 was a huge burden. So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And what is being done with those survivors of detention? Many of them, we've heard the latest cases of one who went back from Holland back to Syria, where he knows he's going to be detained again. The psychological circumstances that they're living at in Europe, I haven't heard. I was actually looking for a psychologist in London to work with a survivor of detention. I couldn't find anything, especially with the NHS. So again, if you were interrogating those people who have survived such a trauma, or maybe not survived such a trauma, what we're doing for them to be able to stand for their rights and then fight for the national justice.
And also, I just want to add something. How we can convince the civilians it will be like accountability or justice. If we back 2013 in August, the regime used chemical weapons against civilians, and it cost to killing 1,500 between children, women, and men in Al-Ghouta, in Damascus countryside. And maybe you know about this time, there will be a decision from NATO and USA to attack the regime, airports and military based. And then suddenly, just that's what European Union told us, there were a phone from Obama and asked them to cancel the operation because Russia entered the issue, and they promise the regime will give them all the chemical weapons that Syria have.
Yeah. Do you ever see a day, Sam, when these trials might even be held in Damascus in some sort of a truth and reconciliation court, or perhaps even a special war crimes court? Is that pie in the sky?
No, it's not. I mean, many Syrians believe it. I've spoken to those Syrians who are working towards that goal, brave men and women in all over the world, because you have to remember there are almost 7 million Syrians now scattered all over the world. Yes, the majority of them are in Turkey, but you've got a very important now Syrian community in Germany, close to 1 million, all over Europe, everywhere. I mean, obviously a smaller community in the US, but they're everywhere. I mean, that's 1/3 of the population. I mean, just think about it. 1/3 of Syria's population is outside the country. That wasn't the case under his father, when his father, faced a similar challenge. He did what he did, and there was the massacre, but you didn't have 7 million people outside the country plotting to maybe someday go back, plotting and working to hold the regime accountable. I'll just very quickly, before we take questions, the way it was described to me by the lawyers, the Syrian human rights lawyers that are working on these cases, is that justice to them initially was like a brick wall. Nothing. I mean, they couldn't do anything, because to refer the regime to the International Criminal Tribunal, there would have to be a unanimous vote at the Security Council, and that was continuously blocked by China and Russia. So that's not a possibility right there. So they started bringing these cases in countries like Germany and France under the principle of universal jurisdiction, and also, as Zaina mentioned, using this idea that there are Syrians who hold dual citizenship, French citizenship, like the principle of the French school in Damascus, and his son, who are dual citizens, and they were arrested and tortured by the regime and killed by the regime simply for maybe protesting or posting something against the regime on Facebook. I mean, that was their crime. So now there's a case in France, and there are breakthroughs. There's an arrest warrant for one of the regime henchmen in Germany. There's progress in other cases. Also, there's progress in cases against armed groups that committed war crimes. In France, there's a case against the Army of Islam that was controlling suburban Damascus, and they're accused of killing a group of protest leaders, activists. The most famous one is among them is Razan Zaitouni, who was who was the co-founder of the local coordination committees and was allegedly and most likely, it seems, killed by this militant group for speaking out against them and their practices because she felt they were doing the same thing that the regime was doing. So there are breakthroughs. The Syrians are not going to give up, and we saw also what happened in the U.S. With the Caesar Act. I think that's a huge achievement. This is in connection with the, if you remember, his code name is Caesar, but he's an officer in the intelligence services, and he was tasked from 2012. From the beginning of the uprising to photograph I mean, this is the kind of regime that we're talking about. It's almost Nazi, documenting everything, wanting to have a paper trail, wanting to have files on everything. So this officer was tasked with photographing the bodies of victims of torture in regime prisons who were stacking up in a depot at the hospital, the military hospital in Damascus. And I mean, we were talking, the amount of photos, I mean, that he took. Do you remember, Zaina, how many photos there were?
55,000.
Yeah, but all these photos, I think, documented close to 7,000 individuals who were tortured to death in regime prisons. And most of them were the peaceful activists, because this was right at the beginning, between 2011, 2013.
Thank you all very much indeed. Let's see who would like to ask a question.
No corona questions, please.
Now, in a nod to coronavirus, we're not going to pass around a microphone. So I'd ask you to speak up, and once you've asked your question, I'll repeat it because we're live streaming this, and we'll make sure everybody can hear that way. So I'll begin with you, then you, sir, and then you.
Thank you guys for being here. I'm curious what the impact of the film For Sama has done with all of this stuff, and I'm also curious, what does the Russian government want in their involvement? I don't know if that's that book, and that's why I have to.
Okay, who'd like to tackle that? How has the film For Sama helped the cause? I assume it's helped the cause. How has it helped the cause?
I think it helps in many ways, but the most important ways it's to reflect the life in Eastern Aleppo, on the ground to the people. It's very important to know how it's difficult to bring a baby child on the life on war environmental, and this is more challenge even if you are a doctor or a civilian or a humanitarian worker. It will be more challenges or more than the civilians or normal life. So it's maybe emotional, but also it's giving a lot of stories about what's happening on ground and to thinking about it. And it was a big chance if it is Oscar winner to maybe just memorize the people or just remember them about what's happened in Syria. But unfortunately it didn't. But I cannot talk about the For Sama more and more because I wasn't one of them, but I watch it, and when I watch it I just like a normal day maybe for me. Also it was many films also like The White Helmets and another films. So it's very important, and this is also it's different about what's happened in the history, in the old history. There will people make have their cameras and photo everything. So what happened on the ground to just reach the voice of the ground to the people. So I think it's very, very important.
If I may add, for the last 9 years, there was a question, what should the Syrian do? I think we've done it all. Since the last 9 years, we've been fixers, journalists, most of them were actually free of charge fixers. We're very good at dying as well. We're very good at being used as weaponized refugees attacking the others. So we've really been doing lots of things. Many, even like in the very harsh stage of Aleppo, were Googling the English translation of their tweets to be able to reach the audience. So, and they were, Raed al-Fares is someone that we should always mention whenever we're speaking with international audience, because for me, he is one of the very few icons of the uprising. He was translating, he wasn't speaking well English, he was translating everything, and he was standing in solidarity in his hometown in Idlib with the Black lives, with all of those who are being harassed or being suppressed, or even like national disasters. So they've tried in all means for the 9 years to voice themselves. But I think after the chemical attack in Al-Ghouta, that was a time where Syrians felt we've been documenting everything, so the international community would interfere, thinking that if we show it to the world, they would care. At that point, I've seen a change in the atmosphere. There were many citizen journalists who dropped, who changed their minds, who felt that they need to be embedded with one group or another to be protected. And many of them were very much desperate to continue because they felt that there is no hope. So there are still people who are trying to do that, but I think they're mostly doing it for history more than making an effect.
Can I ask you, are people watching for Sama in Syria?
Yeah.
In Idlib? Do people have DVDs? I mean, how does
not
it?
DVDs, but they have internet, and there was some free links, and it's distributed in many groups.
And the regime is not trying to stop it?
I don't think so, because the internet, it came from Turkey, and they don't have an access from the regime.
I see.
and
So people know about it and they're watching it.
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Would you like to tackle what does Russia want out of this?
Sure. I mean, before I tackle Russia, I'll just say a quick thing about for Sama. I think just like the lawsuits that are being brought against regime figures in European courts, and we've had some breakthroughs recently. I mean, it's an opening in that wall of impunity in the case of the lawsuits. Here in this movie, which is made by a Syrian, is about Syrians, and it's in their voice. I think it's an opening in that wall of silence and apathy, because people have stopped for years to care because it's too complex, too many players, Russia, Iran, Turkey, you name it, and then of course ISIS and Nusra, and that sort of sucking the whole air out of the room and all of the interest, because to many people they totally forgot how it all started. So the movie came to remind us of how it all started, being told by this mother. And it's incredible. It's powerful, and I think it is an opening. It's a crack in that. It's a big opening in the wall of the silence and apathy. It's hugely powerful. So in terms of Russia, yes, I mean Russia sees Syria as a launch pad, a place where it can challenge the U.S. Challenge Europe, where it can have its air bases, where it can have a place to challenge the U.S. and use it as a launch pad to say Russia is back. First and foremost, I mean, Syria has been a testing ground for Russian weapons, and even Putin said it himself. I mean, he said we've tested. This was back in 2000, I think. 18. He said we've tested more than 300 new weapons in Syria. And as you know, selling weapons is a huge business for Syria, as it is for other powers, including the United States. So Putin is back. I mean, he's saying Russia is back to the region. It can't be pushed around. And I think also you can't separate what happened in Crimea with Syria, because Putin was watching, very closely what the U.S. and its allies were doing in Syria. The regime did everything, used chemical weapons, and the West did nothing. And he concluded from the Syria experience that he could go as far as, annexing Crimea, and the West would do nothing. And I think now, of course, he wants to find a way maybe to strike a bargain again with the Europeans and the Americans to say, look, I can help you with so many things, but including Syria, I can help stabilize the situation. And why don't you maybe remove sanctions on me? But I think it's proven to be a lot more complicated than that. But maybe, Liz, you want to say something on Russia as well.
Well, I think that, yes, it's turned into a great big bargaining chip for President Putin. We now know he's going to be around forever. And he wants to leverage it to do two things: increase Russia's power in the Middle East and also get rid of those damn sanctions, because he wants those gone more than anything. And I think after the U.S. election, we'll probably see that game begin to play out. Yes, sir.
First, thank you all for a really helpful panel. I'm sure everybody agrees it's just really very useful and really so important to have the complexity described. Zaina, we've worked together at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting for 7 years now? 8. Including an amazing time when you lived in country at great risk and remarkable efforts you made. I just thought to personalize it, maybe you could tell one or two stories of the people you and we have worked with on the ground and the courage they show and what they do on the ground, because there are amazing tales. And the flip side of that is, what does it amount to? Sam started to get that answer, but where do you practically feel this adds up to, working with the civil side in Syria? Where does it get us by continuing the incredible work that you guys have headed up? So stories, one or two stories of courage, and where does it take us?
Okay, stories are difficult, but the shout I gave for the women journalists who are still active in Idlib, actually we did work with many of them, because when I went back to Idlib in 2013, there were no women who is practicing journalism in that, in North, and by North I mean only Aleppo and Idlib. There were a couple of in Raqqa only. So I initiated this housewife journalism training where I invited all of those women who are interested, and most of them were housewives, to just know what journalism is. And many of them end up being like a kicking ass journalists who are still working until now, and they're making living out of it. And the fascinating thing is that their stubborn husbands were pretty much against them at the beginning, when they found that that woman is making 100 per piece, and this is compared to the Syrian pounds, it's like a whole salary for 6 months now. It was like, okay, do you need a fixer? I can be that now. And the women who are working there, they do need fixers because they cannot move on their own. They do need a male guardian to pass the checkpoints, and he needs to speak on their behalf when they're on the checkpoints. And they can't really use the motorbikes, unlike the male journalists. They can't even interview a male because there are no public spaces, and they're not allowed to mix in public spaces. So many of women actually use their kids and their husbands to do interviews on their behalf. This is before having Skypes, or they're not even allowed to have men on their Skypes, as they don't allow to have men on their Facebook and social media. So all of this is why they shout. They are really on the bottom of this line because the amount of difficulties that they're facing is the maximum. And above that, especially of those who dare to show their faces and stand in front of the camera, it's very easy to dishonor them. It's very easy to attack them. The first thing that would be said about any woman who's saying something someone doesn't like is she's a whore. And that, in this context, is deadly. It is deadly because some angry armed person can kill her because she is dishonored, and he would go to heaven for doing so. So this amount of challenges would tell you how determined those figures who are still acting in this community are, and how important to keep the support that we're all trying to give to them in these circumstances. I think for them even to survive, whether inside Syria or outside Syria, many of those who immigrated or took refuge in Europe, they continued working with international journalists, international media outlets now. So like just planting those seeds that if we have Syria back, and I'm not as hopeful as Sam is, we will be having them then, and if we don't, we will just have a better equipped people around the world.
I have to say I've covered Syria for as long as I could before I was eventually thrown out after the siege of Aleppo, because I said on air that the Assad government had committed war crimes, and that was the end of me in Syria. But I am still almost moved to tears when I recall how many people so bravely stood up and spoke out and protested. I mean, I think I glimpsed is behind this regime is an astonishing country of extraordinary people. If they could get beyond Bashar, what a country it would be. Let us hope that we get there.
We actually just discovered before that we were in Aleppo at the same time. We were both in the eastern side, in the rebel-held side, and they were both in the regime-held side at exactly the same time. So they were watching us being bombed.
Yes. And what a terrible, impotent feeling it was. I mean, it was just horrifying. Not as horrifying as it was for you to be being bombed, but honestly, to see that as sort of the theater of the most grotesque was very upsetting.
Not to interrupt, but Zaina told me, and I learned, I said, where do you live? And she said, right on the front line. And I said, well, that's really dangerous. She said, no, that's much safer. The bombs are going over, and you have a little bit more leeway.
Yes. You had a question, sir.
Yes, I did.
I'll come to you next.
And it copies the first question actually, but with Turkey. So what? And I don't want to direct the answers too much, but what is the Turkish ambition from their intervention recently, especially at the sort of twilight stages of the conflict? And it would be interesting if you could bring in sort of the Kurdish dimension.
Oh boy. I see people are leaving. It's so mind-bogglingly complex, but why don't you take a crack at that?
Sure. Thank you for asking that. It's hugely important. I think we have to remember, obviously, there are a lot of historic and cultural ties between Syria and Turkey. Families, historically, I mean, you've got a lot of Syrian families that trace their roots to Turkey. So it's hugely important. I mean, it's the longest border between the one between Turkey and Syria. And it's always been a very complex relationship. I mean, under the father, they've had, under the Hafiz, they had sort of on and off rapprochement. And at one point, the father hosted the commander of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan. He was hosted in Damascus for almost a decade. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Hafiz was preparing to hand over power to his eldest son, Basil, he sought to I mean, using the regime's terminology, to tie some loose ends. So he arranged for Abdullah Öcalan he expelled him from the country, and he was arrested in Africa with the help of the Israelis, I believe, and handed over to the Turks. And then you saw under Bashar al-Assad a much warmer relationship. I mean, they signed free trade agreements. You saw Erdogan come to Damascus. There's a very famous photo of him holding hands with Bashar al-Assad in the main souk in Damascus. And I mean, that was a point where Bashar realized that he needed Turkey, he needed some sort of rapprochement to the West, and that's when Bashar was being touted as the reformer. And even up to the first, I mean, when we had the protests in 2011 and the regime crackdown, Turkey was trying to talk sense into Bashar, and it sent a few envoys, including the foreign minister at the time, Davut Oglo, telling him, stop the killing, we will back you if there are elections, but just stop the killing. But obviously, I mean, he knew the moment he made the slightest concession, that would be the end of it for him. And then you saw Turkey, I mean, what I described earlier, intervene along with Qatar to try to effect change in Syria and bring Islamist allies, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood, to power, because as you know, the AKP, the ruling party, is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in a way. I mean, the international movement. And so things didn't work out for Turkey the way it thought it. I mean, Turkey was among those calling for a no-fly zone from the very beginning, pushing hard for it. And I think in the very beginning, it could have saved a lot of lives. It could have stemmed, the tide of refugees. I'm talking the summer of 2012, if there was some sort of no-fly zone in northern Syria, it would have helped tremendously. And as you all know, I mean, Turkey has borne the brunt of the refugees. You have close to 4 million Syrians, I think, in Turkey. And we've seen a backlash in Turkey against Syrians. They were attacked. And then Erdogan felt, because of, he lost in the municipal elections, particularly in Istanbul, the major city, he felt he needed to do something. He needed to show, Turks that he's making it possible for Syrians to go back. But this brings me to the main motivation for Turkey in Syria, which is the Kurds. And here, I think this is really what drives Turkey at the moment, is to have this buffer zone between Turkey and Syria, and to populate this buffer zone with Sunni Arabs that are friendly with Turkey. And that's what's driven, the assaults that we've seen, the first in Afrin, I think in 2018, and then most recently last year, to try to disrupt this ambition of the. I mean, when we talk about the Syria's Kurds, we have to be very careful. Yes, the faction known as the YPG is the strongest and most well-armed faction that's allied to the U.S. and in the fight against ISIS, but they don't represent all of Kurds, all of the Syrian Kurds by any means. And Turkey sees them as terrorists. They consider themselves freedom fighters. And yes, they are linked to the PKK. They are an offshoot of the PKK, despite their continuous denials. And it makes the situation very, very, very complex and potentially, explosive, as we've seen, on a number of occasions. And at the end of the day, it's the civilians in these areas, in these border zones, that are paying the price. In Idlib, I think, again, all of this fits into this attempt by Turkey to carve out this buffer zone that extends from northwestern Syria to the northwestern Syria, Idlib, to the northeast, to parts of the northeast, and have it populated by Syrians that will be friendly to it, and also ideally move, many of the refugees, move them back into Syria. But it is demographic re-engineering at the end of the day. That's what we're looking at if Turkey gets its way.
Yes, you had a question.
Hello. It's really important for, I think, all of us to be here today, particularly because we get to hear Syrian voices, which is generally so rare in these types of gatherings. So thank you particularly to Zaina and to Abdulrahman. I commend you, Zaina. In fact, I bow down because I understand how difficult the work is that you're doing, particularly in training female journalists. I'm a Yemen specialist, and I was in Yemen for 2 years, and I was training journalists there. And so I really, really, really understand. And I think that people generally underestimate the bravery of the people on the ground. And I think it's really important that people like you are given a platform to express that, because we as journalists and media professionals have to give the people in the struggle the voices that they need. They're activists in their own stories. And as journalists, we generally tell people's stories, but people can also tell their own stories. So thank you very much. The question I'd really like to ask you in particular is for you to further explain your feelings about the UN, demolition aside, but in terms of how you think that the UN can, if you had a chance to say talk to Geir Pedersen, who's the UN Special Envoy to Syria at the moment, what would it be that you would say in order to perhaps change the way in which the UN functions in Syria, because they're not going anywhere. So if you had maybe 3 advocacy points, what would they be?
Did everybody hear that question? Okay. Zaina, over to you.
Okay. Well, in terms of humanitarian, we've all read and hear all the story about the corruption. Like, for God's sake, they've been living in the Four Seasons for the last 9 years. whatever they're doing, yani whatever good job that they're doing for humanitarian people to live in the first season for 9 years, and they know that the first season is owned by a cousin of the regime. This is like an actual direct funding. But again, they have the impunity not to be punished for giving money in an indirect way to a sanctioned regime. So even this for me is very challenging. And when the needs is when the humanitarian aids are mostly needed in sieged area, they were not capable of passing over any of this. So I'm not an expert in that field. What I'm going to be speaking about is where my expertise is when it comes to really using women's issue in a very damaging way. I'm going to be speaking about the Women Advisory Board. For me, as a Syrian woman and a feminist, was very much advocating for women leaders to be taking positions. When the UN decided very proudly to follow the 1235 communicates and create Women Advisory Board to advise the always men advisors, or UN advisors for the regions, Yemeni and Syria were on the same file. They didn't just give a justification for the committees who are sitting on the tables not to include women, because there are already other women who are advising the special envoy. But again, they told the women that your role is just to be on a second seat advising the men who are sitting on the table. So that was, for me, is a killing mistake, especially because it came from the UN. The advisory board is still on, and they still think that it's a great idea because they put women into discussions. For me, if we don't have it, at least we will feel that there is something wrong. But having it would just make us stereotyping and emphasizing that women are not powerful enough to be seated on the table. So in that phase, I think they made like a huge mistake that is feasible. And the Mediterranean, I'm not sure whether Abdulrahman has more, but because my knowledge is pretty general, and I know that, especially with the recent assignments, they actually, I don't know her name, but the person who was assigned, there were a picture of her celebrating with the Red Crescent on the other side of Aleppo when Aleppo fell into the regime. And she is now the UN special manager. Because to be assigned, when I was in Syria, the head of UNDP was the son of Walid al-Ma'allim, who has been the foreign minister. You can't really get assignment from the UN or any international organization unless you're signed off. You can't even get a journalist visa unless you're signed off by the regime. And as long as you're signed off by the regime, that certainly doesn't mean you're neutral. So this is the first step to recognize where is standing where.
Did you want to add something, Abdulrahman?
No, in general, the UN, we feel they have no power, they have no action points, and they just
take a huge salaries.
Yeah, and maybe lying on the humanitarian issues on people, just maybe to control for some issues. That's what we faced. Because, as an example, in 2016, Eastern Aleppo was under siege by the regime and its allies, and also in the same times in Raqqa, there were an area controlled by regime. It's surrounded by ISIS, and we asked UN just to sending like a humanitarian aid from the sky. It's during the WFP, and they rejected the order or the request from Eastern Aleppo, and they approved for the Raqqa. We are happy for Raqqa, of course, but why they rejected this? Just because of Russia. So the UN is just maybe like wajha yani, or
a front.
Yeah, a front for something we don't know what's happened in the background. And maybe they are happy when the people they blame or organization blame them because they feel they have a rule and they don't do it. But that's their rule. That's just the people talk about them and do nothing. And then the solution, it will come from the political, and it doesn't.
And I think it's very scary for me to think that they're there and they're going to be standing and they're our only hope. For me, this is pretty scary. Because if we're not thinking outside the box of the UN, we're very much stuck. On the political level, we know we're not getting anywhere. So if the political procedure that is heading by the UN, which I think you all forget started in Geneva a couple of years ago, we need to find our own ways, which are grassroots initiatives that are supported back, because obviously the UN is standing, but just to get their salaries and leave us alone.
Yeah. I mean, if I may add something very quickly on the UN, I think for the UN to continue to be involved, there has to be a fundamental and drastic overhaul of the way they do business, because their excuse continuously is this is the legitimate government of Syria and we have to deal with it. And I'll give you just a quick example of what this means, on the ground. In 2013, Dame Valerie Amos, who's now the Dean of SOAS, declared the situation in Syria an L3, which is on par with tsunami, which required immediate mobilization. So it meant they had to, fire up the trucks with the aid, the food, the medical aid, and immediately go to the front line. I mean, demand first, of course, from all parties a ceasefire that wouldn't jeopardize, the lives of the aid workers and the people driving these trucks. If they get the ceasefire, immediately they would go to the front line, go into the areas that were being bombarded, that were the scene of the conflict, distribute the aid, and help people and help the injured, evacuate those of need of immediate medical care. I mean, just like any emergency in the world. But instead of doing that, they sat in Damascus for 6 months to negotiate with this regime the terms of their operations in Syria. And this, under the terms of their operation in Syria, they would have to send a fax, and I'm not kidding, a fax. This is how the regime operates. Not an email, a fax, detailing where they want to go, why they want to go, what they intend to take into these areas, by minute details, like the contents of every box. And they would send this fax to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs then would turn over and send it to the military intelligence. So they're sending it to the entity that's actually killing the people in this area. And military intelligence would then decide whether to grant this approval or not. And in most cases, the approval never came. And some of these faxes just sat there for years as people were being bombed, starved, and deprived of medical care. On top of that, the regime offered these areas surrender deals. I mean, I have the text of these deals, and the number one item on this surrender deal, the sheet, is if you surrender to the regime, the bombing will stop, and you will get UN aid. I mean, they use the word, they say United Nations trucks will go into your area to deliver food. You will be fed with, these rations that are paid for by you, by people here in this room. I mean, effectively. And if you don't surrender, you will not get this food. So this is what was happening. Meanwhile, in regime-controlled areas where people had fled, to go back just to survive, they were being fed. So the idea is, if you surrender to the regime, you'll get food. If you continue to criticize the regime, you will not get food. And the UN was complicit in this. I mean, I can't find a better word. I mean, they were complicit in what was going on. And I think the number one thing they need to do is actually investigate this. There needs to be accountability for what they did. And the second thing they need to do is to completely rethink their model, the way they operate in these war zones. And I think really, I mean, I know your question was about recommendations, but I think this goes to something a lot more fundamental than that, in terms of, I mean, there has to be a rethink completely. And I think this is important not just for Syria, for any other conflict zone in which the UN wants to be involved anywhere in the world, including Yemen, including places in Africa and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the close of this. Did you have a very quick...
Yes, I was at a paper given last year in London by a judge of the International Criminal Court who praised the evidential quality of the work of the Beirut police in regard to the Lebanese Prime Minister's assassination. And some 3,000 phone calls were traced in the 24 hours prior to the assassination from buildings adjacent to which the assassination occurred. And that's great to have ICC justice describing the power of documentation.
Those are hopeful words.
Yes.
Let's just all, pray for a reckoning, a proper reckoning. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being with us, all three of you, and thank you all for listening and also for your excellent and very direct and tough-minded questions. I'll say goodnight, send you all out into the virus-contaminated world. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you soon.